Tonight's topic is How Does Islam View Terrorism, Part 2. And our host, Connell Friel.
Good evening. Welcome to the American Family Association Presents. Every week we hear of suicide bombings in Iraq, where an Islamic terrorist goes into a public place and blows himself up, killing dozens of innocent people, mostly women and children. We hear reports every week of Islamic terrorists torturing and beheading people, mostly fellow Muslims. We hear of Sunnis and Shiites killing each other every day. Most Americans cannot comprehend what's going on in the minds of these terrorists. Do they really believe, by blowing themselves up and killing innocent women and children, that God or Allah will reward them with 72 virgins in heaven? What are the differences between Sunni and Shiites? Why don't we see groups of leading imams in Iraq publicly condemning suicide bombers, both Sunni and Shiite, telling them in unison, these are evil acts displeasing to God or Allah, and such acts warrant punishment in hell rather than reward in heaven? These are topics we want to discuss tonight with Saja Chowdhury and Frank Russo. Saja is a member of the Speakers Bureau of the Islamic Center of Long Island. Saja holds a master's degree in Islamic Studies and Christian-Muslim Relations and International Affairs from Hartford Seminary and Columbia University. Frank Russo is president of the American Family Association of New York and serves on the boards of Morality and Media and the Nassau County Conservative Party. Welcome, Frank and Saja.
Thank you.
Mike Mulhall is my co-host, and he'll pose the first question this evening.
Thank you, Connell. My first question is to you, Sajad. What do you believe is the thinking, and I mean, I don't mean to put you on the spot because we're trying to obviously explain something that is irrational, but in terms of the suicide bombers, regarding the moral equivalence between good and evil, especially when they're impacting so many innocent people, what are some of the reasons that you could possibly offer our viewers tonight that play a critical role and why they seem to have been so prominent?
Thanks, Mike, for that question. You know, I can't put myself in the mind of anybody who does something like that. As we discussed in the previous program, you know, suicide in and of itself in Islam is forbidden. It's condemned in no uncertain terms. And then, you know, this aspect of terrorism in which innocents are being attacked unannounced, you know, anything like that where you're not in a battle situation, you're just indiscriminately killing people. This is certainly, in no certain terms, it's condemned in Islam. That being said, I think, again, going back to the issue of the political context of this whole of this whole circumstance, I think it's been given a religious sort of support by calling these suicide bombings, and we should be very clear that a small minority of clerics have said that this is something that is either permissible or understandable in the conditions that these people are in, that they believe that they are contributing to some sort of good end. Whether it be for themselves or for their cause or what have you, is a separate story. But I think, you know, putting that into context and saying, okay, what is it that these people claim to get out of such an operation? Well, you know, for them, unfortunately, the situation is so disorderly in the first place that creating more disorder for them seems to be sort of taking them in the right direction. And as ironic and as crazy as that might sound, you know, being in that type of environment, and you, Frank, I mean, I'm sure you might be able to comment on what it is that you saw going on in the Iraqi society with the documentary that you mentioned. You know, I mean, you might want to be able to shed some light on that. But from my perspective, at least, the political and the religious being combined, these people think that they are, you know, achieving some political end for their cause and possibly achieving some religious end for themselves. But again, I want to stress that suicide in no uncertain terms is condemned, and the killing of innocents is in no uncertain terms condemned. So it's unfortunately it's a complex issue, but maybe you can shed some light on what you think what you think is going through their minds on a day-to-day basis.
By the way, the documentary was Voices of Iraq, which I think portrays the typical Iraq citizen, and you really sympathize and empathize with the difficult situation they're in. But with regard to the suicide bombers, and I've just been wondering about this so much, because there's not just one or two, there are dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of these fellows. They're all being trained. I think in their minds, they think they're going to be rewarded by Allah by going to heaven and getting 72 virgins. That's what I think most of them, I don't think they're doing it for money. There might be a few, but most of them I think are doing it for this religious motivation.
To your point about the money, though, at one point, Saddam Hussein was paying the families upwards of sums of $25,000 to each.
That was in Palestine. That was in Palestine,
correct.
apparently.
So there was, there was opportunities for them to benefit financially for
I
their
think
family.
in Iraq, very few are doing it for money. I think they believe they're going to be, they're giving their life up. They're killing women and children mostly, and elderly fellow Muslims. They think they're going to heaven, and what I don't understand, which of, I don't know if, and I know you're telling me what you believe to be the truth, Sajjad. I just don't know. There are other aspects. I've just been reading so much about Islam lately, where certain parts, certain verses and chapters in the Quran that suggest other things about vengeance and persecution is worse. The worst thing to suffer is persecution, I think it is.
Persecution is worse than killing.
That persecution is worse than slaughter. Yeah. Is worse than, so if they feel they're being persecuted. So it could be part of the underlying principles in the Quran as interpreted by a certain number of Muslims, or for some reason the imams and leaders of the Muslim people, both Sunni and Shiite, are failing to grasp the necessity to go out and tell the people in unison, this is evil and you're not going to heaven and getting 72 virgins, you're going to hell. And why they're not doing it confuses me. I just don't, again, unless it's in the Quran, unless the Quran has this dichotomy of views, and there's certain parts to it where it talks about strike terror into the hearts of your enemies, of Allah and your enemies, Quran 860. We're in, like the Christian faith, it's love your enemies, turn the other cheek. And so there's a very big difference, and I'm just not sure if it's a legitimate significant variation in an interpretation of the Quran, or why are for some reason, assuming that's wrong, then why are not the imams going on Al Jazeera and going public and getting huge numbers together, filming it, giving it to the media here? And I know the media would cover it if this happened. If you had a huge meeting of the leading and most respected Muslim leaders, and they came out in unison and said that this is evil what you're doing, Allah condemns what you're doing. He doesn't sanction it. He's not going to reward you. This could discourage them from killing these hundreds of innocent women, children, and other Muslim men.
Well, Frank, I think there's a couple of things that you raised, so I'm going to go one after the other briefly, hopefully for each of them, but in the interest of time, of course. As far as the imams condemning this and saying this is evil, I think, again, I'm going to stress that the channels that most Muslims are tuned into, most American Muslims.
Is there a channel number or a name?
No, I mean, I'm saying, the sources of knowledge, for example, the scholars that one would go to, okay? For example, in the United States, our scholars, which sit, many of the leading scholars sit on something which is called the Fiqh Council of North America. And this is a leading body of scholars, Sunni and Shiite, men and women, who sit on a quarterly basis or as needed to review, problems or questions that the Muslim community in North America might have to deal with. And similar councils exist around the world, regionally as well as for each country. And I am not aware of any council, and I can say this in no uncertain terms, that has said that these things are sanctioned or that these are allowed or that they can create some sort of justification for them. In no uncertain terms has everybody...
but have they done it publicly on TV?
I mean, publicly.
Can you tell me what channels?
Publicly for their audiences. For example, in Pakistan...
I'm talking about
right.
to the Western world.
Well,
to hear this, it's got to get on the media, on television, on radio. We've got to see it and hear it so that we can visually picture these leaders, all of them coming out and saying this. Until we see this, we don't believe
I've
it.
personally read blurbs, in terms of the media's coverage. I've personally read blurbs in leading journals here, New York Times, so on and so forth, about, meetings that happen on such a scale around the world. But they're, in most cases, they're small blurbs, so they don't really, talk about the nuances of those discussions, so on and so forth. So I've seen it. It's not on mass media.
Is it in any media? Any video? Get me the videos.
And as I said last time,
We'll air it.
We'll work on getting you that video. On the and two other points on that on your last comment, I think, again, given the fact that politics and religion are so enmeshed together in that context, in the Iraqi context, for example, if I have a majority of scholars who have said this is wrong, which I know that has happened, but if I find a scholar in a particular context saying that this is sanctioned because this is what you're going through, then that fatwa might be, fatwa is the word that we use for a non-binding religious opinion. That fatwa, unfortunately, in the context of Iraq, for example, is something that they have adopted. Some people have adopted. It's not something that the majority of the people in Iraq adopt either. But for the people who are committing those atrocities, those aggressions, those operations, they have adopted them. Now, when it comes to that, again, the vast majority of people, if I was to 1.6 billion people in the Muslim world today, including 7 million in America, 99.9999% don't believe that any of these things are Islamic in any way, shape, or form.
So to your point, unfortunately, then,
Yes.
You're saying is that because we focus so much on the bad,
On the negative.
suicide bombings, on Iraq, we've allowed that to define, in a sense, what we believe to be
Islamic.
supported or widely viewed, because nobody's really come out, as Frank said, on major media, meaning the Western media, to say that we're widely against this.
You're absolutely
allowed
You're
to
making a
flourish.
mistake.
No, you're absolutely right. And well, let me
Not
just
doing it.
Well, I don't think it's that we're not doing it. I think that, again, within the Muslim world and within the Muslim communities, we are very aware of this. The fact that people outside our communities don't know it is something that I think for whatever reason, and I'll bring out a case in point. CARE, which I brought up in the last program, has in no uncertain terms, deemed these atrocities un-Islamic. They've spoken out against them, but for whatever reason, and whoever is doing it, CARE itself is the subject of allegations of supporting extremism.
Didn't CARE at some point try to insinuate that this was an Israeli bombing of the Twin Towers?
No, not at all. Not at all.
I thought
They
I
have,
read things
no,
like
not
that.
at all.
Again, I'm not.
They have in no uncertain terms condemned everything. If it's a Muslim, which we know that Osama bin Laden has done it, it's a wrong act. It's not an Islamic act. The Fiqh Council of North America has said that. But again, I think it's political. And I'm going to say one last thing on this, even though there's a few more things I can say. But what I wanted to say was suicide bombings as an instrument of warfare, okay, or as an instrument of inflicting some sort of harm. These were not pioneered by Muslims. Muslims are not unfortunately the first ones doing it. Unfortunately, there have been others doing it. In fact, I don't know if you're aware, but from 1980 to 2003, it was non-Muslims who completed the most suicide attacks. Would you know who they are?
No.
Okay, just let me hold you there, Sajjad. We've
Sure.
reached our halfway
Okay.
point in
Okay,
the
we'll come
show. Please stay tuned for this public service announcement. We'll be back in a minute. Thank you. Sorry, I didn't want to.
Stay tuned.
When's Daddy coming home? Soon.
Other news, negotiations broke down again.
Daddy, Daddy! Cheers! Cheers, wait!
You got me, dear.
So how was work?
Brutal. One meeting after another. I got a ton to do tonight.
At the end of the day, when the weight of the world is upon you,
Daddy doesn't want to play. Hey!
isn't it amazing
All right.
how the weight of their love can lift you up again?
Hey, you guys coming to dinner? Hey, guys.
For a free brochure about rediscovering the joy of your children, call 1-800-A-FAMILY and focus on the family.
Welcome back to the American Family Association Presents. We're speaking tonight of How Does Islam View Terrorism, Part 2. Our guests tonight are Sajjad Chowdhury and Frank Russo. Sajjad, you were making a point. I don't want to let you get back to it.
Thank you for that. Well, yeah, quickly, I think the point I was making was that Muslims, unfortunately, and we're talking about a very grim topic, suicide bombings and terrorism, but Muslims were not the ones to have pioneered this. You know, we have, from 1980 to 2003, to give you the most contemporary example, it was not Muslims. And I was asking Frank, who do you think that is? Do you have?
No.
Well, the fact of the matter is that it's the Tamil Tigers in South India and in Sri Lanka who pioneered the modern use of this tactic. And from 1980 to 2003, the most suicide bombings were counted amongst that. And that's a Hindu organization fighting against Buddhists. Again, there are political issues there also. I can couch that as a religious issue, but I don't make that mistake because there are political grievances there. There's the Hindus, the Buddhists.
But they don't think they're going to heaven. They don't even believe in a heaven.
No, they have their own concepts of salvation and reward and punishment as well.
I mean, we have a very Muslims and Christians, you know, heaven, hell, one God. So I mean, here I think it's utterly confusing to think that they think they're going to be rewarded by God with heaven as a result. And to the extent, again, my clear message, it would be so helpful to the Muslim image in America and across the world if they got this message out, that this is what the Muslim teaching is, what we view the Quran correct teaching to be, and anyone who says otherwise is wrong. Right. I think they should do that publicly.
You know, and part of that effort is what I'm doing here, and I'm thankful for that. But again, going back to organizations like CARE and stuff, I think an effort has been made, but unfortunately those organizations are maligned. And that, again, it goes back to politics and agendas and so on and so forth. So we'll leave it at that.
Yeah, Sajjad, Dinesh D'Souza said in his new book, The Enemy at Home, that the war on terror is really a war for the hearts and minds of traditional Muslims, and in fact, traditional people everywhere. To what extent, if any, is Islamic anti-American rooted in a revulsion against what Muslims perceive to be a growing atheism and moral depravity in American culture?
Okay, well, great question. As far as Dinesh D'Souza's comment is concerned, I think I would disagree in the first sense with his comment. I think you can't view the war on terror in any circumstance, I think, as trying to win the hearts and minds of anybody. I think if that is what the purpose is, the purported goal is, then I think that it's a failure. Because the war on terrorism is unfortunately viewed by many in the Muslim world as a war against Islam, and that's just a matter of fact. If you travel in the Muslim world, people do have the perception.
What criteria would they use to make that judgment?
You know, the criteria, I think, to them are very simple. I think, again, going back to some aspects of the post-colonial era, the fact that, you know, most, if not all, major political conflicts, territorial conflicts in the world involve Muslims in some way, shape, or form. Whether you're talking about Kashmir, whether you're talking about Chechnya, whether you're talking about Afghanistan, or whether you're talking about Palestine, and now, of course, unfortunately, in Iraq, when a foreign force, any force, comes in to say that we're going to now take care of this situation, and unfortunately, let's be very honest, and unfortunately puts it in terms that are not going to be taken lightly in the Muslim world. And what I'm pointing to here is President Bush's use of the word crusade, very short after 9/11. You know, this is a crusade against the forces of evil.
But the president did come back and recuse that comment. He had not realized how that would.
The word was.
But he did apologize.
He apologized, and that's fine, well and good, and I think, you know, that being what it is. But the sentiments of 1.5 billion people, you know, media is throughout the world, and so when a leader of the stature of President Bush uses a word like that, you know, he may have meant something, and that's up to him.
To be fair,
yes.
Because you can, and I think this is exactly where we find the breaking point is in terms of misunderstanding in the United States anywhere, is the fact that many Americans don't really know how to feel about the war in Iraq. Part of them recognizes that there's been immense sacrifice. American sons and daughters went to fight a war to liberate a country that was held by a brutal dictator who murdered 1.4 million people over 25 years. That's the same population as Nassau County. And his own people.
Let me get some.
But my point is,
No, I understand.
and I want to get, because I feel very strongly about this, because this is where the disconnect is. And
Right.
because, so
But we didn't
Muslims-
go there to free the people. We went there because we thought Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he did not. We are there now. I think we're staying there now really to avoid a total massacre of one, and a civil war and a mass killing of one group of Muslims by another group. So we're trying to straighten that out. The reason we went there was not, though, to free a people. And I think we've got to get that clear.
Well, I would differ ever so slightly, with all due respect, that we went there with, I think, a number of topics. One, Saddam Hussein had used chemical weapons against, in one instance,
He had a
5,000
basis
people.
for it. He had a basis. We had a
5,000
basis for
people.
thinking
And
that.
that operation was funded by America.
Yeah.
That operation had the tacit approval of America.
That I'm not prepared
We
to
had
accept.
Mr. Rumsfeld, who was meeting Mr. Saddam Hussein and giving them the green light for
But
the
let's be
operation
very
that Mr.
fair
Saddam
here.
Hussein was
This has been a very illuminating conversation and a series of exchanges, and I don't want to do anything to change that.
Sure.
But let's be very fair. Nowhere will you find people in our government, even as badly as you may think of them, Donald Rumsfeld included, nowhere did, when they gave those arms or anything that they gave to Saddam Hussein, did they ever think he would be using them against his own people?
Yeah.
The American people, right or wrong,
Right, I don't think
Democrat or
yeah.
Republican,
Yeah.
I think view this a little bit differently, in the sense is, Frank's right, the concept of the war has changed, but I guess in the end, the real conflict here for Americans are, we want to see Iraq prosper, we want to see the Middle East prosper, we want a better relations with Muslims, we want to be a part of the wider world, and for people here in the United States, particularly here in New York, where they've given up their lives. Think about it. Americans died to free and liberate Iraq in some sense, and yet there's this sense of we are the oppressor. We are, as you were saying before, the occupier.
Well, you know, I think we should tease out the topic, and it needs to be teased out because, as Frank said, you know, the intent in going in was purportedly for weapons of mass destruction. And over time, over the course of months and the past few years, it has changed now into a war of liberation. And then we have the overarching umbrella of the war on terrorism. So there is a very sort of, if I was to say, you know, in plain terms, confused set of priorities for why we're going in. Now, if the goal of America is to see a prosperous Middle East, to see a free Iraq, to see a free Afghanistan, to see so on and so forth, there are other ways to do that other than going in and frankly, in their view, occupying the area.
Let me make a few, yeah.
And sorry, Frank, just quickly, you know, there were Iraqi groups that have been supported by the Iraqi resistance groups that had been supported by the United States. There were political resistance groups. But even there, we saw instances of, unfortunately, America just, you know, it's a matter of putting yourself in that context and not projecting one's own ideals or ideal view of the situation on something where you just don't understand. And we have plenty of American leaders saying we just did not understand what was going on.
Most of America wants to get out of Iraq as soon as we feel that there won't be a massacre. But we're changing the subject from what the topic was. And I wanted to ask Sajjad a question, again, and maybe this is at the root cause. Am I correct in thinking that while the basic message of Christianity is one of love and forgiveness, is the message within Islam one of vengeance? That's what I'm increasingly seeing as I started looking at parts of the Quran and comparing things, and that's what's motivating some of these suicide bombers. And I think the imams, again, I hope you're right, but I really don't. I think the Muslim leaders have failed to convey to the public, to the world, and I think it's 1.3 billion Muslims. The latest number I said, anyway, 1.3 billion. And I think they failed to convey to the non-Muslim world how the Quran really teaches about suicide bombing and terrorist activities. They've dropped the ball. They have an opportunity. We've got the media, and I don't like the media in this country. It's very liberal. I don't agree with, but I don't think they would fail to portray and convey a message that the bulk of the Muslim leaders wanted to convey. I think the Muslim leaders have really failed us here. And if what you're saying is correct, and I so much want to believe everything you've said, I think we've got to get the Muslim leaders on television saying this to get this message to their young people, young men, and even now, unfortunately, some young women who are going to these marketplaces and blowing themselves up and killing all these innocent people. And it's destroying Iraq. Most of these people are just trying to survive. My heart breaks for them. Right. And I'm wondering, is it the message in the Quran, is that vengeance part being confused and overshadowing the good parts of the Quran? And why aren't the imams conveying this message?
Frank, I think as far as vengeance in the Quran is concerned, we have a 1450-year some odd history of peaceful coexistence with societies that were at the periphery of Muslim lands, that even came within Muslim lands. There was political conquest, just as there has been in every empire. But for example, I would point you to some research that's been done by a professor over at Columbia, Richard Bullitt, and in his works, he's shown how Muslims that came into Iran in the medieval and classical period, for 3 centuries, the population data tells us that people remained of their indigenous religions. They did not convert. They were not forcefully converted. I mean, there is no jihad by the sword to convert, as we said in the last program, no compulsion in religion. And as far as this vengeance is concerned, the verses of the Quran that you're pointing to, if you put them in the proper context, which we must understand, the Quran is understood and believed to have been revealed over a period of 23 years. It addressed numerous topics. It addressed social ills, it addressed theology, it addressed history, and it addressed economics, sociology, so on and so forth. And in the same way, it addressed conflict. And that conflict was addressed because there was conflict. There was political conflict at that time. It was not a conflict of Muslims against infidels for the purpose of stamping that out. It was a political conflict that arose, yes, based in the fact that Muhammad was preaching something that society
But I mean
did
today,
not like.
I'm talking about today, I'd like to see them talk more about freedom of religion. Change those Muslim countries to allow a free discussion of religion. Christians can't practice their religion in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
This is 500 years behind the times.
And this is changing because we know this is changing because the political systems in the smaller countries around in the Gulf region, they're all becoming more democratic. We've seen elections in Bahrain, we've seen elections in Kuwait, we've seen elections in many of the other areas there, and we will be seeing that, I believe, we'll be seeing those changes happen in Saudi Arabia and many other places as well.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for a lively discussion, and thank you for joining us for American Family Association Presents. We hope to see you next week at the same time. Good night.
This program was brought to you by the American Family Association of New York. If you'd like to receive AFA's free newsletter, write us at P.O. Box 203, Port Washington, New York, 11050, or call us at 516-944-3544. Our newsletter and TV schedule are on our website at www.afany.org. Your comments are welcome, and thanks for being with us.